Hi class, this is Michael, your instructor, with a introductory lecture on language documentation. So we'll be talking about this for a few weeks, going into different aspects of what documentation is and how it's applied and how it's done. And this intends to give you some overview, concepts, and terminology to move forward. One underlying tenet I'd like to get across is that documentation work is not value neutral. And what I mean by that is it's easy to assume that we're just going through a simple process when we're creating documentation. After all, we're just hitting record on a tape recorder or digital recording device. We're just writing out what we hear or see as part of a speech event, language event, and then we are putting that into some field notes or publishing that into some sort of book or article. And that can seem like a standard process that doesn't have a whole lot of decisions about values, decisions about ideology, decisions about methodological structure in it, because it is it's fairly process oriented. But it is important to recognize that when recording, what the purpose of the recording, what's done with the recording, what methodology is employed, all involve subjective decisions by people that influence the product, success, and outcomes of a documentation product. Like other types of research, documentation work can be conducted in ways that are beneficial and empowering to a community, or they can be done in ways that are negative, disempowering, and serve to create conflict and animosity. And so it's important to recognize that as we're working in this field. So here's some documentation-related vocabulary that we'll be running into. First is metadata. Metadata is all the information that's collected in addition to the language documentation. So metadata can be where you recorded, who, when, what type of equipment you used, and other contextual information. In my work, I interact with archival recording of first-generation speakers that are the best remaining examples of speech in a language, and some of those recordings have more or less metadata. Knowing who, where, and when is important. And as a piece of cultural heritage ages, it may acquire more important metadata along the way, such as who has preserved this resource, who owns it, is the material copyrighted, and has it been cataloged. Next is translation. Translation is the process of converting speech or writing from one language to another. Something that many of us are already familiar with. Transcription is a little different. It's more specific. It's the process of systematic representation of language in written form. Orthographic transcription uses standard spelling systems and orthography of the target language, the one that you are transcribing, to write the text. A phonetic transcription uses the International Phonetic Alphabet to write out a specific phonetic and phonological properties of a language. So that brings us to another term, orthography. Orthography is simply a fancy name for a writing system for a language. And there are lots of different examples of orthographies from around the world. Most languages today have some sort of orthography, but many languages throughout time had no orthography at all. They were primarily oral and passed down orally without any need for writing. The Roman alphabet is certainly one orthography that we are most familiar with. International Phonetic Alphabet is another. Japanese characters or Canadian Aboriginal syllabics, which are pictured here, used by the Inuit, Algonquin, and other languages. And orthography should accurately represent speech on paper. English is a language that is well known for being inexact, or because we have to rely on memory, known rules or context to determine how a word is pronounced. There are all sorts of silent letters and difference in spelling that are really just make English a kind of infamously challenging language, because that connection between the way the language is spoken and the way it is written is not always very tight. When you're using something like IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, you're getting a much closer, much more exact representation of speech. The word, so in English, the word read is one example. You have to know the context to know what type of read or you're talking about. Is this something, a plant growing, or is this the process of reading? Good orthographies can certainly be inexact. There's nothing that makes this unusable. The English writing system is certainly very well used. But as long as they are accepted and understood by the community, an orthography is perfectly fine and acceptable. From a revitalization perspective, it's more important to have an agreed upon orthography than one that is fancy or is going to impress your linguistic friends. And without a writing system, as shown in numerous articles and examples, you can have lots of chaos in your education, documentation, and revitalization efforts. One community that I work with has multiple orthographies being utilized simultaneously within one language community, which causes, as you can expect, a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of disagreements, and a lot of incompatibility of efforts between different groups of people who are working on language. Orthographies can also derive personal, emotional, ideological, political followings and connotations to them. You know, if one respected person in a community has created an orthography, there may be emotional attachment to that person or ideas of superiority compared to other writing systems that have been created. So ultimately, what's most important is to find that process of orthography standardization, to pick one that works, even though it may not be perfect, and make sure it is one that is going to be able to be utilized and understood and worked with. And from there on out, people will learn whatever orthography they're taught, just like people will learn whatever language they're taught. And it's often a challenging process to go in through the work of selecting that orthography, but once you do, it gets much easier from there on out. Let's see. The International Phonetic Alphabet is certainly an orthography that is widely used. It's got lots of complicated symbols that are difficult for non-linguists to work with. Practical orthographies can bridge that gap. They use the specificity of IPA symbols in combination with already familiar characters. So you might see an orthography that has something like a number 7 to indicate a glottal stop. And that may be easier for people to write or to work with instead of the IPA symbol, which is a question mark without the dot. So those are just one example of practical orthographies. And many orthographies were developed during the era that we had typewriters and other word processing, early forms of word processing. So they were very dependent on what could be typed on a typewriter, what could be easily word processed on a rudimentary computer. And so these orthographies are fine, but now modern computers can write quickly in any keyboard in any orthography needed. Last piece of terminology here is a corpora, and that's a set of documentation materials compiled for a language. If you go into a community and record vocabulary, stories, a poem, and 3 interviews together, they are a corpora of data. And you can research ideas within this corpora or between various ones. It's always useful to think about when we're thinking through documentation is, what is the goal here? As we've seen in other lectures, that there's lots of different rationale for why preservation is attempted. That can be mainly for academic purposes, and that may be the reason that some documentation is done. There's certainly linguistic, anthropological, and community-based research that is all academic related and isn't necessarily immediately connected to other revitalization or other preservation processes. Maybe a language is not necessarily endangered and is being documented just for research purposes. There is certainly lots of linguistic work or linguistic anthropology work that occurs from languages that are seen as quite healthy and robust in terms of their speaker base. And different goals for documentation require different methodologies, equipment, permissions, and personnel. Documentation projects often require substantial amounts of time, money, and people. Academic specialists are often required for transcription and technical consultation, and these projects are hopefully grant-funded because they can be quite expensive. Some grant and repository agencies require community participation, some don't. Some grant work and particularly if you're getting funding from a federal government, there may be requirements for how that information is disseminated and it acts at its level of accessibility and how it's shared. There may be requirements that documentation becomes fully publicly accessible, which may or may not be difficult for the community you're working with. A best practice is to integrate training in documentation for community members to increase skills and ability to do this work in the future, so there is not always a reliance on outside presence. Some more on types of documentation that occurs. Documentation may be to preserve cultural knowledge for linguistic study. It may look at language context, shift, or ideology. And sometimes there are different types of documentation or motivation for documentation that are done by a language community or the documentation done by others. I don't necessarily like this distinction. I agree that different people conduct documentation as seen in many cases, and we'll see arguments that how documentation is used for cultural preservation work, but I don't like the dichotomy that communities are doing something different than academics. And there may be different methodologies when community language communities doing their own documentation work compared to outside academics, but it's really the objectives could very well be the same. Communities are just as capable of conducting academic research as anyone else, and it's important to determine your end goals and output strategy here. Here's just one example of a documentation. One product of documentation work is this looking at language contact and how different languages have branched out over time. So tracing back historical linguistic work to find these proto-dialects or proto-languages that came before others. You can see ones that have disappeared over time and where some of the roots of modern languages come from. It's pretty interesting that all of these languages, which we think of as highly divergent, something like Hindi and Czech, all have a common ancestor. They may have that common ancestor existed a long time ago, but they still have that common ancestor. And then to see, other language groupings that we may be familiar with, such as here's some Latin languages that have similarity, or Slavic languages that may have similarity. So, interesting application work. Documentation strategies. The format of recording is an important decision, and audio and text-based are certainly the most common. Video is also a good idea because you can capture body language, gestures, and mouth movements. If the language you're recording is something like sign language, or one of the international sign languages, then video is going to be critical. Franz Boas was a proponent of recording raw speech. He is famous for recording recipes for blueberry pie and thousands of pages of detailed text. Now, he was not a trained linguist, but he did pretty well, and he certainly made up for some of his shortcomings by collecting in volume. Raw and conversational recordings are really crucial for being able to document natural speech, conversational styles, and be able to look at how those important aspects of speech work. There is the ethnography of speaking. This is from Gempers and Hymes, who are integral in this field, which documented and studied speech acts and performance. It's also known as poetics. That's another documentation strategy. Vocabulary elicitation is a common documentation practice. This is where a technique for documentation where the recorder asks questions like, what is the word for tree? And the speaker provides it. So you can see that is quite different from something like a raw speech or a conversational recording. You're getting a much different product in the end. Participatory research, Woodbury, Dobrin, Burson, both all ask how to build a participant group to accomplish language documentation of an endangered language. Documentary linguistics has evolved from detached research to a Boasian approach to whole language documentation. So we've seen that shift occur. And building a community of documenters is certainly not without its challenges, but all the way back from Boas, people like him have believed in training local members of a language community to conduct their own recording to be able to obtain as accurate and bias-free language documentation as possible. George Hunt is an example of a Kwakiutl man that Boas trained and published with throughout his time researching. The last term here is salvage. Salvage anthropology or salvage linguistics are both kind of terms that are interchangeable. Salvage language recording was popularized in the late 1800s with people like Boas and his students, Sapir, Kroeber, and others. And the premise was that native cultures were rapidly becoming extinct, and it was up to anthropologists and linguists to document as much material as possible before that extinction happened. Little attention was really paid to ethics, and the results of this documentation should not necessarily be viewed as comprehensive. Unfortunately, the salvage work may be the only remaining knowledge of some languages, and it is only as complete as the researcher had time, funds, and availability to do. Salvage documentation certainly continues today, with many language communities facing extinction, and those people trained in documentation having to go in and really document anything they're able to in the time that they have. Who does language documentation? Well, it can really be done by anybody. Lots of different people, from those who are trained in academia to those members of the community who may participate and want to do this work themselves. It's always can be challenging to have different people with different agendas, but it's certainly not an exclusive practice. The next part of documentation, which we'll spend more time on in subsequent lectures, is dissemination. If you're writing a grant to do language documentation, you have to have a strategy for both data preservation and dissemination. It is now something completely expected. And it's going to dictate part of your methodology as well, because the outputs and the products and the ways you're going to share that work are going to determine how you are doing the documentation in the first place. A grammar, a dictionary, a classified word list are common products of documentation. Grammars are complex linguistic publications that can be challenging for others to read. But they're also important for understanding the functionality of language, the rules of speech and writing, that syntax. They're very time-consuming efforts for linguists and typically aren't what make people much money, but they're very valuable. Dictionaries are word lists, text-based catalog of the known words in the language with translation. Again, very time-consuming to produce, but can be made more collaboratively with non-linguists. Modern dictionaries and grammars contain conversational speech, cultural context, and historical information. Audio dictionaries are similar to things like First Voices site, the First Voices program that we'll take a look at, and may have linked audio content as well, which makes for a real nice educational tool. Databases are another common dissemination platform, and they can be as simple as an Excel document on your computer. Many language archives are located on personal or work computers and local data servers. These databases can be added to continuously to form a word list or dictionary. It's always important to think about your preservation and your data maintenance, because those local files can be lost, corrupted, or just simply be inaccessible. There's lots of different online repositories out there, and we're going to look at quite a few. Most are academic-based and created by nonprofits. They all have goals of archiving and sometimes dissemination of a language, and many are regional. They're not always user-friendly for community members to use themselves, or even for those academics. Some have a focus on language research and comparative research between languages, and they are certainly important tools and follow international standards for data preservation. Other products can be things like movies, podcasts, animations, media. Using archival documentation products allow student work to occur, and different applications, and hopefully avoid languages becoming static and seen as only a thing of the past, as we'll see in the Meek text. A variety of educational academic projects are also possible with documentation. However, without documentation, none of that work can be done. And in my opinion, the community should always be given an original copy of all recorded documentation materials for their own archival use. So a couple final considerations. Who to record? Recording first-generation speakers is always preferable, but it might not be possible to document first-generation speakers in many communities. And I like to argue that documentation should be an ongoing effort, even when it's done with second-generation speakers and latter. Again, it prevents some of those pitfalls of language becoming static and being expected to never change or have difference. There are also decisions about recording younger people or older people, men and women, certain families, particular employment sectors, and speech is going to vary through all those different groups. Whenever you're doing documentation work, getting the most complete corpus as possible to reflect the variety and diversity of speakers is preferable. Does documentation force a fluid entity into becoming a static object? Well, that question has been asked since writing began. Greek scholars like Plato were vehemently opposed to writing classic epic poems like the Odyssey. They saw the performance of the poetry as the art form that would be ruined by writing. There's still dissent around writing, but most agree it's necessary. How to write the spoken language is an entire field of its own. And access is a complicated one. I could probably teach a whole class on the concept of access alone. You've got to determine who's going to be responsible to access and use the documentation. Different communities will have different ideas about how material should be used, where it should be kept, what barriers are in place, if something needs intellectual property to be accounted for. And I think what we'll see is the legacy of colonization impacts community perspectives on access. As a rule, a community should set access restrictions with full knowledge of their options and consequences. For example, you should make audio recordings listen only and not downloadable on a website. That may be a workable solution for some communities. Others may not be really that concerned with limiting access and instead want advice on how to get as much access as possible. Partnerships with libraries and use of interactive websites can enable this type of sharing. All documentation should articulate copyright and intellectual property of the individual or community. I see documentation as a way to increase understanding about copyright and intellectual property. And usually a researcher will have the ability to use documentation materials for research and publication, but does not actually retain ownership of the materials themselves. Those rights are generally going to be retained by the community or an individual. Accuracy. Many second-generation speakers become silenced by their own languages. They're concerned that their pronunciation is not as good as the old people, and so they avoid speaking. As a documentator, it is valuable to promote multiple types of speaker and types of recording. Again, it works against that notion of a static and only one way that language can be passed down. Finally, following preservation practices gets into the more in the realm of museum curating. There's lots of industry standards, and that's really another whole field unto itself for standards around print and digital archives. I mean, we deal with everything from wax cylinders to things recorded online in a live chat session. And it makes for a huge diversity of formats, types of content, preservation needs, and usage strategies. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to talking more on this.